Hey everybody, the guys over at Classic Headquarters wanted me to talk with you guys a little bit and tell you a little bit about GM fuel gauges. GM fuel gauges have always been a huge mystery. People generally don't understand the principle behind why they work, how they work, or anything like that. So we thought it'd be a good thing to make a video and just show everybody everything about them. Well, in 1965, the General decided they were going to change from a 0 to 30 ohm sending unit to a 0 to 90 ohm sending unit. And this caused the gauges to be more accurate. If you've ever been riding around with your buddy in his 55 Chevy, you look at the gauge and the gauge might be moving just a little bit back and forth when you make that turn. Well, the General decided to make it a little bit more accurate so that didn't happen. So that's what we ended up with from 1965 to, probably in the 90s somewhere. So let me just get started and I'll tell you a little bit about them. All GM fuel gauges from 65 pretty much on up, they all work on, they're all the same gauge. Like for example, here's an AC Delco Camaro console gauge. I'm not sure what this is out of. I can't remember what this is out of. And this is a truck. I do know that. So anyway, the gauges all look different, but if you look at the back, they're all the same. 3 prongs here, 3 prongs here, 3 prongs here with just a backing plate, and 3 prongs here with a resistor. We'll talk about those resistors in just a little bit. So anyway, we've got all our gauges here. They're all the same gauge. They all have 3 prongs. Now, if you look at the back of the gauge, very simple here. If you're looking at the back of the gauge, you have the bottom is a ground. This is your hot. And this is coming in from your sending unit. That's the way they all are. The only one that might be a little different looking might be a Corvette, because sometimes a Corvette, due to the fiberglass body, might have an additional ground strap on it. But they are all identical. So, we'll take these, put these over here. And these are all GM gauges. And here is a CHQ Reproduction Camaro console gauge. Now, if you look at these and you say, oh my goodness, Kelly, what's the difference? Well, the Reproduction fuel gauges now are internally resisted. So, and again, remember I said the resistor is going to be very important. Well, all these are all resistors that are possible that could come on the back of these gauges from the factory. And again, I'll touch a little bit more on that later. However, the CHQ fuel gauge is internally resisted, so you don't have to worry about trying to find this and making sure that this is on the back of the gauge. Because originally, from GM, we'll go back to our truck gauge here. Our truck gauge, there's our resistor. And this resistor had to be in place, because if it's not in place, obviously the gauge will read very strange. Okay, so that being said, what is the principle behind the fuel gauge? Okay, so all of our gauges so far are the same. Okay, so since all the fuel gauges are exactly the same, you'll notice that all of the fuel sending units have the same ohm readings from 65 on up, which is 0 to 90. And what happens with this most of the time is there are a couple things that could happen to cause the gauge to read funny or not read at all. So let me hook this CHQ gauge up real quick and just show you what happens. Alright, here's my gauge. I'm going to take it and I'm going to hook it up to my little test bench here that I've made from an old fuel sender. Here's my float. This will be down in the tank. So if it's empty, be that way, obviously, full that way. So let's go ahead and stick it on empty And let me move this out of the way. Okay, the sender goes there. My ground goes here. And my hot goes here. So my gauge starts going down to empty. Okay? Now, on all GM cars, it does not matter. All GM cars after 1965, if you look at the back of this gauge and you have a plug in your dash that has a tan wire, the hot wire is going to be pink, and obviously the ground wire is going to be black. And that's the way they all are. So, you say your fuel gauge doesn't work, there's something wrong with it. The question you have to answer first is, did it move at all? And if the gauge moves at all, it is generally going to be good. So here's an example why. So say for example, you and your buddy go to put the fuel tank in, and this is on top of the fuel gauge right here, on top of the fuel sender, excuse me. You have the tan wire that goes to the gauge, and then you also have this ground wire here, and this is also going to the back of my gauge. If either one of these get pulled off, it does strange things to the gauge. So, for example, if you put that tank up there and you pull one of these off by mistake, if you pull the sending unit off, the gauge just goes screaming over to full, and it'll peg past full, and it'll stay there. It might even wrap on down toward the bottom here just a little bit. Put that back on. Now, if you knock the ground off or drill through the ground somewhere along the line through the car, it'll keep going, it'll keep on going down, it'll keep on going and get on down, and it'll do the same thing going toward empty. So if your ground is on, now let's put this back in the center here. Okay, we're going to go for half a tank. Okay, so we're at half a tank. You can see that our sending unit that would be down the tank, that's about half a tank because it's straight up and down. Just think of it kind of on its side there. Now, if there was a problem with the pink wire, which is your positive or your hot, watch what happens. Absolutely nothing. It doesn't do anything. That's just like if you were sitting in the car and you went to park and you turned the key off. It cuts all the power. Now, why does, you'll look, and if you notice there's something kind of missing in this whole going into the tank part here. You got a ground wire and you got a tan wire, and basically you have the sending unit here. Now, again, we're all pretty smart here. You know, why wouldn't you want to put a hot into your fuel tank? Well, that's obvious. So, you know, get a nice explosive condition out of that. So, again, if the gauge is moving, it's generally good. And if it screams over toward full and buries itself, sending unit or the sending unit wire or the sending unit ground can slip off, that sends it on back. The ground sends it on back toward empty, and the power or the hot just kills it, just like if you cut the key off. Okay, so now how do you fix all this stuff? Well, let's just put the gauge down here. We'll leave it hooked up. Just let it sit right there. Now, how would you fix all this? Now again, original GM gauges have these on the back. These are all resistors. You have this original style, which is on most of them. Can you see it right there? It's just basically a little wafer board with wire wrapped around it, which offers some resistance. And then these are ceramic resistors, which have their own ohm readings, or ohm values rather. These tend to be pretty close and then these have different ohm values. So for example, if we were to look at these, your wire wound, your red, and your blue one here, they have 92 ohms, 85 ohms, and 83 ohms. Then your pink one here, the pink one is an 85 ohm. Your orange one is an 88 ohm. And your yellow one is a 92 ohm. And your green one is a 95 ohm. Now, you ask me, now, Kelly, why is that important? Well, originally when the gauges were made, let's just take this one right here for example. When this one was made, they had the guy running the machine, and he's winding, he's putting all the windings into the core of the gauge here, and he's winding, and he's eyeballing it, he's kind of looking at it, and it's spinning and spinning, and he goes, okay, that's enough. I'm going to stop that one right there. Well, what that does is when you have more windings, that offers a little bit more resistance. So what happens is, whoever was doing that, they had to go through and say, well, I'm going to mark the gauge. Well, if you look right here, I don't know if you can make that out or not, there's a 1 right there, okay? And let's see, on this one, there is also a number 1 right here. And let's see what our truck gauge has got. Little truck gauge up, yep, there's a big number 1 right there. So, you notice this number 1 has got a blue one, okay? And this is a factory truck gauge. So, if you find one of your original GM fuel gauges, and it has the has a number 1, a 0, or no marking at all, it's going to get the wire resistor, the red resistor, or the blue resistor. Okay. If your gauge has a number 2, it would be pink. If it was number 3, it would have an orange. And if it was yellow, it would be number 4, and green would be a number 5. Now, you say, Kelly, does that make a hill of beans difference? Well, on the original gauges, yes, it did. We're going back to the whole thing of the resistor had to be in place. Just like this one has an internal resistor, that resistor has to be in place to control the sweep across the face of the gauge. So, if you say put number 5 here on a number 1 gauge, when you went around the corner, you at a turn or something like that, you might see just a little nudge on the needle there. So yes, original gauges, it kind of makes a little bit of difference, but there's not going to be a lot you can do about it because these right here are not really available anymore. There are some aftermarket ones. The aftermarket ones generally tend to be somewhere in about the 84 ohm, kind of middle of the road. So, that being said, that's really about the fuel gauge. Now, where we run into difficulty with the fuel gauge is, again, on the back of the fuel gauge. So let me take my gauge off here. And what generally happens is, you have the back of this gauge, there's all 3 of your prongs, and you have a big pile of parts that you had in a bag for, say, 15 years while you were doing your restoration, and it's just in the bag, and you're just, whoa, I have no idea what to do with this. So, I'm here to tell you really what to do with it. Obviously, what you're going to see is, on the original style harness, you will see a plug, and of course that plug is going to have pink, tan, and black. So what you can do is you just get the plug, look at the plug, and you will have, let me find some of these real quick. Okay, we're back now. Sorry about that. Now, what we're going to do is I'm going to show you what you have to do with this pile of parts here. These terminals, these resistors, and I'm going to use the CHQ reproduction gauge here. we'll do it first because the reproduction gauges are more common. Okay, the CHQ gauge, this is a Camaro console gauge plate. The fuel gauge goes here, oil gauge would go here. Now, the fuel gauge goes just like this, into the holes. You turn it around, and up, there's our 3 magic prongs again. Now, here's the pile of stuff that you had in the bag for 15 years that you don't know what to do with. Okay, this little jewel, this is your ground strap. Ground strap goes on just like this. Okay? Now, since this is the reproduction gauge, we're not going to worry about these resistors, but I'll show you the AC Delco gauge in just a minute. Alright, here is the wafer board or isolator. It goes on next. Goes on just like so. Okay? And now, again, we don't have a resistor to go on here because it's already inside the gauge. We're going to take this terminal and this little terminal right here. And if you notice what they're doing there is they're making the exact same pattern that your plug is. Okay? So, now we have to take these, put a lock washer on here, lock washer here, lock washer here, nut on here. I'm not going to tighten those up, but you get the idea. Nut there, and a nut there. Okay? So that's how it fits together. So all you would do is your plug comes in, hopefully you've got it hooked up to the sending unit, the hot, and the ground like you're supposed to. You plug it in, plug it on these 3 prongs right here, and you've got your hot, your ground just flips up on top up here, and then you got your sender over here. Okay, now you say, Kelly, that's great. What happens if I have my original GM gauge and it's doing like you say, it's going back and forth and it's working? Okay, no problem. Okay, let me mention this first though, before we get a little crazy. What you'll do is, if you'll notice right in here, these little tangs that stick off, these little positioning arms that stick down, when you tighten these up, when you tighten these nuts up, make sure that you're not trying to bust a vein in your forehead trying to tighten those things down. Because what's going to happen is, you're going to do one of 2 things. You're going to damage the gauge, or you're going to ground these little tangs against this ground plate right here, and then that's not gonna be good because it's going to ground everything and the gauge is not going to read at all. So now back to what we were talking about. We were going to go to the original GM gauge. Just for expedience, I'll leave the CHQ gauge, the CHQ reproduction gauge in here. The only difference when you have an internally resisted gauge is you're going to, if you do not have the internally resisted gauge, which is the reproduction from CHQ, and you're using an AC Delco gauge that is not internally resisted, what you're going to do is you're going to, some of your original cars may have this one. You just check the ohm values across the 2 plates here to make sure it's functioning properly. Same thing with the ceramic resistor. You just test right here. Now, what happens here is we take these back off like so. The wire resistor will actually, let's do the ceramic resistor first because this will probably be the most common. Ceramic resistor goes on like this. Again, you got the locating points right here. They go like this and like this. I've seen them 2 ways. I've seen them with the wafer board, which is, to me, not correct, because if you notice when you put that thing on there, see how you got the difference in height? So I've seen it done both ways. I prefer to do it like this. I take my wafer board off completely, drop my resistor on, put my arms, or not, put my terminals back on, and then zip zip, tighten those down. Again, The resistor is a little thicker, so there's really no problem with trying to make that connection right there. But again, you don't want to tighten it down so tight to where it actually damages something. Okay, so now if you have the wire wound resistor, take this back off, fish that off like that, wafer board goes back on, wire resistor goes like this. That goes like that. That goes like that. And you see it doesn't, it's a little bit thinner, so it doesn't make connection right there. And we tighten it all down, and everything lines up just right. Just like that. Boom, boom. And your brand new wiring harness or your original wiring harness plugs right on, and everybody's happy. So word about console gauges. Console gauges, if you notice, this gauge is actually connected to a plate. The plate is actually down inside the console, and there's a cover that's on top of it, and you have your oil gauge here, and you have your battery and temp gauge. Now this gauge plate has to ground to the other plate, because the other plate grounds into your console wiring harness, which should connect to the floor or body somewhere down the line, and it's usually right under the console. If that does not, if you don't make that connection and you don't make the ground, again, the gauge will not function properly. It thinks that it's missing a ground, so the gauge goes and pegs toward empty. So, that being said, that is it. GM gauges in a nutshell. I hope this little video has answered all your questions. Again, thanks to CHQ Classic Headquarters for letting me make the video and show you guys a little bit about it. And again, if you have any questions, just hit us up on the email on the YouTube channel, and have a great day.